Welcome to the Energy Show. I'm journalist Markham Hislop. My guest today is international trade economist Peter Morrow, an associate professor at the University of Toronto. On Sunday, the United States and China agreed to a 90-day cool-off period that slashes the latest round of reciprocal tariffs. The American rate on most Chinese goods falls to 30% from 145%, while China's tariff falls to 10% from 125%. Sector-specific U.S. levies on autos, steel, aluminum, and fentanyl precursors stay as is. Remaining tariffs on Chinese imports are still stacked on top of the 25% Trump imposed on many industrial goods during his first term, with lower rates on some consumer goods. Now, President Donald Trump's tariff war has roiled international markets and raises the risk that the global economy will fall into a recession. Is the tentative deal with China a sign that Trump is backing off? What are the implications for Canada? Does this mean that negotiations to the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement might be possible after all? Welcome to Energy Talks, Professor Morrow.
It's great to be here.
Well, look, we're going to talk about China and U.S. trade talks that took place this weekend in Switzerland, and we'll get to that. But I have to tell you, I get a lot of feedback from our viewers across Canada, and they're just mystified. They don't understand what Trump is doing. In fact, I've talked to economists who are stumped and don't know what Trump is doing. Do you have any insights for us? Can you explain it? Is there a strategy here?
It's really unclear whether there's a clear, coherent strategy. I think, as you mentioned a second ago, a lot of academic trade economists look at what's going on and we say, this is not the way we think about the gains from trade. This is not the way we think about why countries trade with one another. Trump really, if you hear him talk, seems to really have a mercantilist view of international trade, where you say, if I export to you, I win somehow. And that may have been true hundreds of years ago when countries were trying to accumulate gold. But the way trade economists think about it now is that the gains from trade are really on the consumption side. You get access to goods that you're not good at producing. And so therefore, the gains from trade are really on the import side. So when you hear Trump talking about, we're winning, they're losing, we're saving money by not importing, it's really not the way trade economists think about it. So it's really unclear exactly what the plan is. And even if there is a plan, I think when I look at what he's done, the thing that jumps out at me is that he's found these tools, these tariffs, that US law allows him to adjust basically unilaterally. This is not something that has to go through Congress. We have various trade law acts in the United States. You hear people talking about Section 301, Section 232. And these are laws that were passed, I believe, in the 60s and 70s that gave the US president, the right to impose tariffs in emergency situations. And for a long time, presidents said, okay, well, I'm only going to do it if it's really an emergency, and it's not an emergency. And President Trump, he's busting norms, and he's saying, well, if I say it's an emergency, it's an emergency, and I don't need to go through Congress to do these things. So I think that's how he's doing it.
Is it possible that an entire administration could be, I'm searching for a word here, I was going to use deluded, ignorant of, but just simply doesn't understand trade, doesn't understand economics. I mean, there's a lot of talk about Peter Morrow, who is Trump's primary trade negotiator, not being exactly a trade expert and not understanding this. And you would think that a nation as powerful and as big as the United States, that couldn't happen. But maybe is that a possibility?
I think it is a possibility. I think if you looked at his first presidency, he had a lot of people surrounding him who were a little bit more business oriented and thought about how supply chains work and how modern multinational enterprises work. And these people said, trade works in a much more complicated way than you think it works. And I think this is why we saw some of his, if you want to put this way, worst impulses restrained. And in his second administration, he surrounded himself by people we're much more likely to just say yes to him and to follow his whims. Now, in the last couple of days, you've seen Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent having a little bit more sway and pulling the administration more towards how we think the gains from trade tend to work in a modern global economy. But it's unclear if he understands how it works.
Yeah, well, by when you say unclear how it could be the president or the Treasury Secretary. We're not.
Sorry, I meant the president. Sorry,
Oh,
I
okay.
meant the president.
Well, look, Besant and the Chinese vice premier were in Switzerland. They had a couple of days of talks. What
Mhm.
did they accomplish?
I think they walked back from the ledge. I think that's the best way of putting it. So you look at the agreement. U.S. tariffs on Chinese exports have gone from 145% to 30%. Chinese tariffs on U.S. exports have gone down to 10%. I think of a lot of, hitting this theme again, a lot of the worst impulses have been reined back. But I do think it's a matter of two steps back, one and a half steps forward. We're in a worse place than we were in January. We tariff Tariffs on China are still 30%. That's much higher than the 5% that it was before his first administration. So I think if you asked the trade economists in 2015, suppose that we're going to have 30% tariffs in 2025, they would have panicked, but that's a lot better than 145%. So I think we've stepped back from the ledge, I think is the way to think about it.
There's a lot of talk about the decoupling of the two economies. And
Mm,
when the Biden administration was implementing its industrial policies like the Inflation
mhm,
Reduction Act, I read a lot of speeches by people like Gina Raimondo, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce,
mhm,
Brian Dees, who headed up the president's National Economic Council, people like that who said, look, we understand now this isn't so much about climate for us. It's about geopolitical conflict and about national security. We cannot be dependent upon Chinese supply chains in case we get into a conflict with them. We just can't do
mhm,
that. And so but their approach was to say, okay, we're going to build up our capacity here. We're going to build
mhm,
battery plants and EV plants and all of that. So
mhm.
we'll build that and we'll subsidize it and put in industrial policies. And Trump seems to sort of intuitively understand that the two economies can't be as tightly coupled as maybe they were because energy, national security. But the way he's going about it is like taking a meat cleaver to it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we also had the Trans-Pacific Partnership 10 years ago that sort of flamed out. And this was the original approach to try and have a slightly more aggressive approach by the US against China to try and sign agreements with countries geographically surrounding it. So this is something that's been on US policymakers' minds for a long time. This is not something that they're coming up with all of a sudden. And in the way he's approaching it, you're right, he is taking sort of a sledgehammer to it, but the way he's doing it is injecting a lot of uncertainty into the process. And I think that's really hurting. If you had the Biden industrial policies that you mentioned, they were predictable. They went out, they talked to industry representatives, they stated very clearly what they were trying to do. And now we see a policy where the US trade policy is lurching from one extreme to another. And even if you agree about the end point, it's not clear what a business is supposed to do if they want to still have some relationship with China for goods that are not strategically important, say textiles or footwear.
Right. There's been a lot of talk about the fact, and I'm talking about business press like Bloomberg, for
Mm-hmm,
example, and Reuters. I see this all the time. Uh,
mm-hmm,
where they're talking about the first Trump 1.0 and saying, look, that China kind of got blindsided by then. They weren't
mm-hmm,
expecting Trump at that time, but they were expecting him this time, and they were well prepared. And the effect of Trump's policies will actually fall much more on the United States than it will on China, which is now diversified and has exports into the global south and
Mhm.
really has a strategy to cope with Trump. And I'm just curious what you think of that argument.
I think I generally, to a great degree, I tend to agree with it. I think you talk to people who sort of pay attention to geopolitics, and they say, okay, Trump 1.0 might have been an aberration, but this is the way the world is. Trump 2.0 is the way the world is. And these countries, especially China, said, okay, we need to be insuring ourselves. We need to be developing trade relationships with other countries. And in the past couple of months, we actually have seen Chinese exports to the world be fairly resilient. They've bought, there was a large run up in Chinese exports to the United States in terms of businesses trying to get goods in before the tariffs kicked in. But even after that, even when Chinese exports to the US have sort of fallen off a cliff, Chinese exports to the world have actually been doing okay. So I think in some sense, this Chinese strategy of trying to be prepared has ended up working for them.
I have a little hypothesis that I want to run past you.
Sure.
After Biden introduced the 100% tariffs on EVs last May,
Mhm. Mhm.
and there were some other tariffs on solar panels and other things, but they were lower, 25 to 50%. And my thinking at the time was that, in fact, Biden was making a strategic error because what he was doing was telling China, okay, you can't come into Fortress North America because, of course,
Mm.
Canada followed in September with the same tariffs. He said, and China just went, okay, we'll go to the global south. We're quite happy. We'll go into Asia and Latin America and Africa and other
In
parts of
Europe. In Europe.
yeah. There's lots more world other than North America
Yeah.
for us to go and trade with. And then you look at the amount of trade that's gone into those regions, it's up. You look at the amount of Chinese investment in manufacturing and assembly, it's up. And China seems it's almost like they played into China's hands.
I think I'm not sure I would say they play into China's hands. What I would, just because I don't think I have a strong feeling about that, but I will say that it's not obvious what the long-term plan is. I mean, there is an analogy to the 1980s in Japanese auto. So in the 80s, Japanese auto quality went way up, really hurt the Detroit automakers. And this really forced a lot of innovation, quality upgrading, offshoring in terms of assembly by North American automakers. And we're sort of seeing that, and part of this was through voluntary export restraints through Japanese autos to not export into the United States. And we're seeing something similar now in the sense that the United States is saying you can't sell your cars here. And China, as you say, China's saying, okay, fine, we'll sell our cars other places. But it's not clear what the plan is. Is the plan that North American quality will improve somehow through this industrial policy, that they will get to equal footing with Chinese EVs in Europe, will, or to the degree that they can open up the US market and still maintain market share? It's not clear exactly what the plan is, or maybe you're right that they are just saying this is where we'll make our last stand in North Fortress North America and damn the torpedoes.
Yeah, I think it's not clear what the North American strategy is because while there was a lot of talk about giving GM and Ford, in particular, 5 years to get perfect its EV game and
Mm-hmm.
become competitive, it's not clear now what that is at all.
No, I completely
Really,
agree.
yeah, it's
I
right off
mean,
the table.
I think, and I think there's a robust debate in this in the industrial policy literature, but we have strong evidence that it's actually competition that increases productivity and quality, not a lack of competition. Now, there's some countries like Korea that have managed to ride the industrial policy path to development, but it's real, again, as you say, it's really not obvious one way or the other if this as you put it, a 5 year plan is going to pay off, or if it's just going to be a series of 5 year plans that are never really removed.
Well, let's talk about where China and the U.S. go from here because
Mhm.
there's a 90-day clock. with some 30-day provisions that I'm not entirely clear of, but clearly there are some mechanisms if things aren't happening,
Mhm.
they basically deals off the table, I think. Um, but where do they what are they doing? I mean, 90 days, they're not going to strike a deal. That seems like not a very long time
Mhm.
to strike a very big deal. So is this just the start of the long journey towards some kind of trade agreement between the U.S. and China?
That's a good question. I would, given the fact that TPP was so politically toxic, I don't see a long-term comprehensive agreement happening. I think that it would take some amazing political maneuvering for Trump to sell a China free trade agreement with to the American electorate.
Sure.
What I will say is that, and this is a little bit harsh, but there is an aspect of the arsonist coming and putting out the fire to this. I think I've seen that analogy a couple times. What I what I mean by that is I don't think that we're going to see many trade agreements in the way that we thought about them in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, where there's comprehensive agreements on agriculture, intellectual property, market access. These things take a long time to negotiate, and there's a lot of vested interest. I think what we're going to see is the Trump administration go in try to figure out a political win, as they like to put it, where the United States removes these onerous tariffs that it imposed over the past couple months, and then there's some minor concessions from the other country.
Is that not what happened with the last the NAFTA agreement when they
That's
got rid of it?
exactly what happened. And I think this is, my hunch is that, at least as it pertains to Canada and Mexico, this is all going to be a preamble to renegotiating NAFTA or USMCA or CUSMA, whatever you want to call it, where Trump is trying to pull that negotiation forward in time. And I think that's generally, I think we'll see something similar in 2026 as we saw in the last renegotiation, where basically things stay pretty much the same. And there's a little bit of trimming, maybe around domestic content in autos, maybe a little bit in agriculture, maybe a little bit in digital privacy, digital rights, but we don't see big changes. For the other countries, for all the sort of quote unquote reciprocal tariff countries, I think we'll probably see Trump peel back the most onerous of those tariffs, maybe get some minor concessions from those countries, settle into something like 10% tariffs by the US on those good countries' exports. And Trump calls that a win and walks away from it.
So the last week, Prime Minister Mark Carney went down and met with President Trump.
Mhm.
And so they had a press conference, and then they went into a working lunch where they started the negotiations around Kuzma. And it was billed as this is the first meeting where we kicked them
Mhm.
off. And there were a bunch of officials from both sides. So it sounds like the process as it's playing out currently supports your hypothesis, right? That this
Mhm.
basically they've already begun negotiations. We'll all go through this kabuki theater of,
Mhm.
and at the end of it, we'll come out with exactly what you said, which is, Kuzma 2.0,
Mhm.
and life will go on. Is given that that's in the direction we're going, what then do you make of Carney's approach, where he said, doesn't matter, don't care, you've ruptured the relationship and the days of deeper integration are over. We're doing something different. From a trade point of view, does that sound like a credible strategy?
That, well, I think we just had the election, so I think it was probably politically smart for Prime Minister Carney to come out in a very nationalist way. I think we saw the ads with Mike Myers; those I think those were pretty effective. Um, but when you get back to down to brass tacks, I think it is a much more difficult question. I mean, the U.S. is such an easy market to interact with. It's big, it's close. Relatively speaking, we have similar cultural norms when it comes to business. It's much easier to interact with the US than it is to find other countries. I mean, the analogy I use is that Canada can decide right now if it wants to do a Brexit. And Carney is kind of saying maybe we will do a Brexit. Now, if we think about Brexit, that ended up being a horrible idea. But this is sort of the negotiating stance that he needs to get into. And I think what it comes down to, and I think this is a broader question having to do with national security, energy policy, as you and your listeners might be interested, is really, does Canada want to be closer to the US or further away from the US? And I think Carney's trying to keep that open for himself. Because you think about all these conversations about export diversification, import diversification, not buying fighter airplanes from the United States. Those are arguments for being less close to the US. But then when we talk about these negotiations, it's saying, well, maybe we want to be inside Fortress North America. And it's really unclear if these diversification efforts on the outside are really worth the pain when we think about the power of having a big, close market that we can interact with so easily.
Now, I'm going to speak to just the energy side of this because that's what I'm
Mm,
most familiar with. But it's the case that the relationship that's grown up between Alberta, which is essentially oil in Canada, their exports and any increased exports have to be the ultra heavy sour crude that comes from the oil sands. There's just you
mhm,
can't. There's no other fields that you can press a button and increase production. That's the only one. Okay, so the Americans have gone over the last 40 years and spent tens of billions of dollars rekitting a pile of their refineries, 5.5 million barrels a day of capacity, to take that oil. And you can't just flick a switch and then go back to light sweet. It doesn't work that way.
mhm,
So, in a way, the Americans are captive to the Canadian supply.
mhm,
And furthermore, they're building out their LNG capacity down in the U.S. Gulf Coast. They haven't got enough domestic gas.
mhm,
And so Alberta gas in particular, but also some in BC, backfills that market because you're stripping more out this way, then you want to
mhm,
import more in here, and now you've got decent prices in your domestic. So there's a scenario here that you could imagine where Canada says, okay, we'll continue to do this. And then, but in addition to that, we're going to do all these other things. Like we're going to turn some of bitumen into carbon fiber and asphalt binder, and we're going to do more, put more of our natural gas into petrochemicals, and we'll ship those off to Asia, off through
mhm,
Vancouver. So you could see where he could argue, let's do what we were doing and then do a whole lot of this other stuff, and we'll be much
mhm.
better off and more secure because we'll have other trading partners. I thought that was a clever approach, and he's kind of hinted at it, but we haven't really seen it spelled out yet. I don't know your thoughts.
I, I, I completely agree with you. I think the question is how easy is it to get your goods out of the country into another market? I tend to use I find myself using Keystone Pipeline as a metaphor for a lot of things these days, and I think a lot of the, in my mind, better discussion that's going on right now is really improving Canadian infrastructure. How does Canada get stuff out of the country?
Good point.
Can we make Vancouver a bigger port? Can we make Montreal? Can we improve domestic infrastructure so that someone in the middle in the prairies can get their goods either to Vancouver or to Montreal relatively easily? I mean, again, using Keystone, regardless of how you feel about Keystone Pipeline, I think it's a very good metaphor for it was a way to get Canadian goods out of the country, and it didn't happen. And now Canada is forced to be closer to the United States. And I think instead of blindly reaching around for these new trading partners, we should be thinking about how do we get our goods out of the country through ports, basically. I think, and also through the country on their way to ports. So I think this is a very important thing for Canadians to be thinking about.
No, that's a very good point, and one I'm sure we're going to be addressing and talking about in the near future. But that's a good note on which to end the interview. Peter, thank you very much for this. It's been very insightful.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. I actually learned a fair bit, so I've had a lot of fun.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach
Thanks,
10,000
sir.
subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.